Underworld, written by B. N. Farley. The form which fell from the carven rim landed with a dull wet thud upon the cold stone landing. The limpness of the copper-skinned body told of its unconscious nature. From above, the sounds of shouting, drumming, and braying along with the flickering flame light could easily make one envision a strange primal ritual, a mass butchery, or some odd combination of the two. As the hours slowly dragged on, the shadows cast by the flames from above, created by the forms of those dancing and roaring, slowly disappeared until only the faint ripple of the light was left, slowly being played upon by the moist breeze which wafted up from below. With an audible groan, the form upon the floor struggled to a sitting position, grasping his knees. Pulling himself up to a crouch, the young man breathed heavily before wiping away his shoulder-length black hair from his face to reveal a strong jaw, high cheekbones, and golden brown eyes, strained with the events which led to him being dumped into such a dank and forgotten part of the world. The dirt and grime-covered hand which wiped away his hair was calloused and rough with the toils of hard work, and his sinewy yet muscular frame confirmed this suspicion. For a great long while the dark-haired young man simply sat and stared up at the circular stone lip of the portal which led back into his familiar and, prior to now, only known home. Faint droplets rolled down his cheeks, washing away lines of dirt, yet no sound echoed through the cavernous underworld in which the man found himself. After a time, the man changed his gaze to his surroundings, staring at a nearby skeleton with a contorted spine, along with the numerous bioluminescent mushrooms which radiated a dim glow upon the surrounding slick rock formations. The flicker of the man's eyelids told that his sight was slowly adjusting. He rose, stretched almost involuntarily, and then noticed the small natural path which led deeper into the caverns. At the beginning, the path was easily large enough to allow for easy traversal, but after several bends, the path thinned until the man was forced to press himself against the cold, slimy walls of the cavern. If he had been a larger man, or any clumsier, he would have plummeted to his death like so many others which had come along this same course and now rested on the cavern floor. At a point down the path, the radiating light of the fungal growths dissipated until there was almost no illumination at all. During this portion of the path, the man seemed to rely more upon instinct than his senses. Like a cat taut with anticipation, all of a sudden the stone under his foot crumbled, and he leapt towards the faint outline of the only ledge he could glimpse. The clatter of the stones below followed the thud of his chest upon the ledge, and he grunted and grasped as he pulled himself up by his sinewy thews. Rolling onto the flat stone, he outstretched his arms, blindly groping, and then feeling only the moist air which accompanied the realization that he was no longer on a thin pathway, but now laid upon a wide plateau. The man laid there for a time, breathing heavily, staring above him into the darkness. Perhaps the man was thinking intently upon his life and the civilization that led to him being thrown into this pit, this cavernous underworld. Maybe he thought of the primitive people which were believers in strange rituals and primordial monstrosities which lurked in the darkened corners of their uncivilized and unexplored world. It was from the worship of one such of these monsters or beings which had landed him in such a position. His people called it Goth, the spider demon, which they made obeisance to by sacrificing one of their young men on the eve of the Hollow in order to appease the hideous thing, lest it crawl up and devour the whole of their people. Perhaps he was thinking of a girl, or his family, but in the end, it didn't really matter. All of these things, his family, loves, his people, were all behind him, and no one was coming to rescue him. Once a person is dropped into the pit, they are considered, for all intents and purposes, dead. It was hard to tell how long the man lay there staring at the blackness of the ceiling, and had it not been for the otherwise complete silence, he would not have heard the friction of scale on stones, which prompted him to rush to his feet. In the greenish, dim light, which only the radiating fungal patches gave, the man could see the slithering shadow which swayed slowly, back and forth, in a somehow almost hypnotic suggestion. The hiss which accompanied the shadow informed the man of his perilous situation. Backed against the sheer drop of an unknown depth, the man's instincts worked seemingly faster than his mind, and he lunged for a broken piece of grayish stalagmite which lay in between himself and his reptilian foe. As he did so, the serpent lunged into a somewhat clearer view, and the man caught a flash of orangish scales and needle-like fangs. The man was quick, but the snake was quicker. Luckily for the man, the thing was not one of the many poisonous species which populated this part of the world, but regardless, the strike of the fangs drew blood and allowed for the monstrous snake to begin coiling itself around the man's now bleeding copper-skinned calf. The reticulated coils began to squeeze with an intensity which made the man scream out in agony, but through the pain, the calloused hands of the man scraped and pawed the floor for the piece of stone which was to him the only weapon with which to possibly fight himself free. Luckily, his search was not in vain, as his straining fingers grasped around the narrow portion of the club-like stone. All the while, the snake swirled and constricted around both of the man's legs, now reaching his lower abdomen. The man flailed, swinging wildly with the broken stalagmite, clubbing the snake about its twisting coils, but the immense scaled muscles showed no sign of weakening. Tighter and tighter the gigantic snake squeezed, and the man's grasp of pain grew less and less as his breath began to be squeezed from his lungs. With natural instinct sharpened by a lifetime of just such experiences, the snake removed its clamped fangs and slithered hideously up, unhinging its jaws to widen around the slowly dying prey. The horrendous odor of the thing's gasping maw wafted into the man's face, and a look of stark, raving terror, only brought on at the edge of death, contorted his visage. At the last moment, as the ravening serpent was to begin its feast, the man lashed up with the jagged point of the stalagmite, ramming it into the fiendish reptile's eye with a sickening pop. The thing twisted and squirmed in its death throes as the stone sank deeper into its brain, and the man writhed, kicked, and twisted until he was free of the deathly coils. As the snake thrashed, it began to slide off into the cavernous gulf, and with a savage kick, the man sent the bulky head into the darkness, half waiting to hear a thud, which never seemed to come. It is a strange thing, this predator versus prey world which has been established. Although predators are viewed as the mighty, the swift, and the intelligent, their entire existence would not be possible without the prey. Without feeding upon those weaker, the predator cannot obtain the sustenance which it needs to survive. In theory, the true power lies within the hands of the prey and their availability for those that feast upon them. Humans, however, occupy an odd place within this hierarchy. In theory, they are nothing more than pinkish sacks filled with red liquid with no claws or fangs to defend themselves, nor pelt to protect them from the elements. Yet with all of that being said, these relatively weak creatures, who should have seemingly been wiped out at the beginning of the world, have constructed cities and edifices, crafted weapons of destruction like none the world had ever seen, and conquered nearly every other form of life which they have encountered. Yes, a single man against the likes of a tiger or a boar is no competition. However, their intelligence, strength in numbers, and sheer tenacity is what allows them to thrive, while other animals simply maintain their standings. When one is slain, more spring up in their place, like severing the head of the mythical Hydra. Still, these humans act in accordance to laws few other creatures even seem to recognize. They dance, burn incense, and make sacrifices to things they do not fully understand. It is almost as though their conscious intellects cannot fully grasp the spiritual underpinnings connecting them to certain beings which their souls somehow innately sense. It is not just that these things which they worship, existing in the dark corners of the world and the planes beyond, could simply kill their mortal bodies. No, in that case, men would worship the elephant or the shark the same. But despite them incorporating these aspects into certain deities, there is something deeper. It is as though mankind can connect in some nebulous way to the blasphemous knowledge that these beings, were they not appeased, could somehow eradicate the very soul, erasing any chance at an eternal life after the one of the mortal realm, and voiding the beliefs which these very religions promised. During the man's descent ever deeper, he stopped along the way to peer out into the darkness, as if straining his eyes to catch a glimpse of something concealed in the black. Eventually, however, he would return back to his immediate surroundings and continue on down his path. At a point where there began to spring up and hang down a number of thick vines like that of a tropical jungle, the man dropped down, hiding behind one of the larger stalagmites as a massive gorilla-sized sloth-like creature slowly climbed along some of the nearby vines. Not only because of the increasing temperature and humidity did the man begin to perspire, but as the slow-moving brownish thing climbed past, he noticed the massive claws and sharpened fangs of the animal. It seemed the man doubted his ability to deal with such a beast in the way he had the snake. Luckily for him, the thing slowly crawled past until it reached a point in the upper part of the cave that it took a turn and disappeared from sight. After a short while of waiting to see if the thing would return, the man decided to continue on, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. As seemed to be his habit, he left a streak of copper skin where the soot had been cleaned away. The man had nothing to eat, and his stomach, already small, had begun to growl, as if to tell him to feed it. Looking ahead, the man could see that after nearly half a day, he had finally reached a portion of this underworld which leveled out, producing a place on which a vast array of vegetation could spring forth with vigorous life. The effect was like that of a piece of land torn from a rainforest and is suspended by a mountain of rock and dirt which led off into deeper darkness by an inconceivable number of smaller tunnels and pathways. The whole of the thing seemed staggering to the man, but he moved on despite his apprehension. The slight luminescence which accompanied much of the vegetation down here was present, although in a smaller degree, for each individual plant, which gave an overall light vastly greater than anything the man had seen thus far. A sweet, almost intoxicating smell wafted up from somewhere, and the sound of trickling waters seemed to draw the man into the lush jungle. Like a panther, the man padded through the undergrowth, barely grazing a leaf or frond. His eyes were opened wide, aware of every sound, smell, and sight, which could easily have overwhelmed any man. The plethora of colors here could almost make a rainbow jealous at the brilliance which was on display. Still, through all of this, the man stalked, quiet, calm, and focused, as his hunger and caution were the immediate urges which drove him on ever deeper. A consistent hum, caused by the buzzing of millions of minuscule insectoid things, pervaded this place, almost creating a hypnotic effect when paired with the candy-like aroma of the flora. If it had not been for the man's drawing hunger, he would not have noticed the subtle change in smell and sound coming from a nearby clearing. As it was, the man slunk into a massive bush and peered through the fan-like leaves. Before the man lay a clearing of hard-packed dirt formed by humanoid hands and feet. Within the spot lay nearly a dozen huts, crafted of a mixture of animal hides and leaves, joined together by some form of rope and stretched across poles of wood and bone. The thing which caught the hungry man's attention was the rather large, headless mammal which had been skewered and was now slowly being roasted over a nearby fire pit. Similar roasting pits were located throughout the camp. However, only the one nearest to him seemed to catch his eye, and his nostrils, and the succulent smell of the slow-cooked meat wafted towards him. It is rather good for the man that he did not go for some of the others, as one in particular was the carcass of a poisonous lizard which could easily have killed the man due to the secretions from its roasting flesh. Clearly, the man had decided a course of action before spying on the camp any longer. His hunger must have gotten the best of his otherwise cautious mind, and as he slunk from behind the bushes, he came to the shocking realization that this camp was not the home of any man. A singular figure was the first the man saw, and it stopped him cold in his tracks. It was not that the thing was horrifying at first that made him stop. No, in fact, it was simply its oddity which made the man freeze. The thing was like that of a man, standing a little over waist height, but it had a sturdiness about its frame which made it somehow seem less diminutive. The little thing, which stood upon two thick leathery feet and had elongated arms which reached past the thing's knees. Upon the rough hands and feet were only 4 fingers and 4 toes. The whole of its back was incredibly furry, and there was no distinction between back hair and that on its head. As the thing turned, the man could see in the strange greenish luminescence a face contorted in rage, and which to most would probably be thought of as a combination of a pig and primate. Hanging from the long fur and oddly proportioned appendages were a number of adornments made of bone, leather, and wood, speaking of a primitive, albeit moderate intelligence. I would assume that to the man, that split second before the storm dragged on, stretching time in a way only anticipation can. A horrid sound like the screech of a dying bird split the still air, and like a nest of yellow jackets, the camp came alive. Nearly a dozen more of the smallish creatures began scrambling out, snatching wildly at crude weapons of stone, wood, and bone. With a speed that would have made a leopard take notice, the man rushed to a nearby tangle of sticks and twine that seemed to him to be a makeshift weapon rack, and he snatched up a wood-handled spear with a head of sharpened obsidian. The first of the furry beasts came on with wild abandon, swinging a sharpened jawbone which clearly would have been used as a cleaver. Ever on the move, the man thrust, piercing the diminutive creature's chest, and in response it released a horrid gurgling sound, along with a thick brownish liquid that must have been the thing's blood. Tearing the spear loose, the man rushed past the oncoming throng, flipping their makeshift tables and containers in an attempt to split their otherwise combined advance. This tactic clearly worked, as the small things had trouble leaping over their half-broken furniture, forcing many to rush around, splitting their fronts. With a high kick, the man sent one of the things flying back over a table, making it tumble into its fellows behind it. Unfortunately for the man, despite the size of the humanoids, they had a speed which seemed to defy their short, stubby legs. Swinging with a backhand, the man caught one of the rushing things in the face with the stalagmite in his offhand, crushing its nose and mouth. With a horrid squeal, the beastie fell to the ground, a crumpled, still quivering mass. Despite the man's speed, the things were beginning to catch up to him, and one with a rock club caught him in the ribs, which knocked the wind from the man and tore the skin ever so slightly. Gasping momentarily, the man caught his wind, fending off any oncomers with his bloodied spear before finally leaping over the very same bits of jagged, broken wood which he had toppled. Once again splitting the horde, the man glanced around for the best means of escape, and for some unknown reason, a large gong of hammered brass held aloft by two sturdy logs tied with a number of small leather straps was what caught his eye. Whistling air caught the man's ear before he ducked, and then the reason for the action became apparent, as a wood-handled stone spear flew right through where his head had been, sticking into the ground a few feet past. Daring another glance back, the man could see the dwarfish, brown-haired things readying more weapons for a greater ranged volley. Sprinting towards the gong, the man dodged past one of the creatures and caught another in the gut with his makeshift club. Unfortunately, the thing grasped the runner's weapon, and realizing that it would have slowed his run, he let loose the club and rushed on. Dodging the spears and other bladed projectiles as they came, the man rolled under the circular sheet of brass. With a thunderous crash, a large stone, which was thrown by an extremely strained, furry semi-human, slammed into the gong. A snap and swoosh signified the beginning of the gong's fall, but it seemed as though the only ones which were affected by the sounds were the little things. Seemingly, all in unison, the creatures turned their backs to the still raging man, and even those closest to him, and in the most danger of being slain, seemed to disregard the immediate threat. The man The man, seemingly not having yet realized the shift in atmosphere, charged forth, skewering one of the small things and lifting it into the air with a hearty grunt, all the while spraying himself on the ground with thick droplets of brownish blood. As the man flung the body to the side, he looked around, now noticing that all of the surviving furry monsters were now kneeled down with their foreheads to the ground in some unknown rite of obeisance. As thick-headed as most of those of the city of Laconia above, the man simply stared at the things in their indecipherable prayers, spinning on his heels and holding his spear in an attempt to ward off the now non-threatening foes. Another snap, and the gong slunk, falling a few more inches as the tethers began unraveling quickly. As the gong tore from its makeshift pedestal, it came tumbling to the ground with a hollow yet incredibly loud series of clangs before spinning on edge and finally resting still. Almost laughable. Everything went momentarily quiet, and it seemed that the man noticed all of the tribal cave people were staring off at nothing, but all in the same direction. What drew their attention was a particular patch of trees, much less dense than the rest surrounding the clearing. The seconds strode on like 1,000 worker ants, never wavering, never faltering, and the man saw this as his chance to escape with his life. He began slowly backing away from the dwarfish creatures before him, watching all the while around him to make sure as to not startle or aggravate the hornet's nest in which he found himself. After only a few steps, the man heard what the pygmies were waiting for. A roar, like that of the clashing of two thunderbolts, cracked the air in the direction that the cavemen were staring, and at that sound they all bowed their faces back to the ground, and in some obeisance the man did not seem to understand. They mumbled out a series of unknowable chants, even louder to whatever was coming. At this, the man broke into a full run without waiting to see what was on its way. A glance back as another roar broke the tree line revealed a crashing saurian monstrosity with green and black striped hide. The thing was a mountain of scales, fangs, claws, and spines, and with slavering relish it snapped up several of the cave dwellers before spotting the moving prey. The man turned his head back to the run before him as he clearly perceived the dire peril which was upon him. The thing which the hairy little beast worshipped as a god, not knowing that it was only a mindless monster, roared again and began rushing into the jungle opposite where it had arrived, tearing trees and bushes apart as it searched for its prey. The man ran on, sliding under a log which could have brained him at the breakneck pace at which he was running. Getting to his feet, the man could hear the sound of rushing water coming from somewhere nearby, and with an involuntary shift, the man began moving towards that direction. The tremendous footsteps of the hideous scaly beast drew ever closer as the man leapt with all his might over a jagged crevasse, which he had barely spotted and in which he would have been plunged to his immediate death, or worse, a slow, agonizing starvation. Landing with a thud, the man's joints ached, his skin bled from a dozen tiny cuts, and yet his adrenaline and the terrifying prospect of the thing behind him pushed him ever on towards the juking to the right, towards the noises of rushing waters. He broke free of the jungle trees, which revealed to him that he was now sprinting towards the edge of the mountainous plateau, only about 100 yards from the drop-off. A massive river of green-blue water was running from the tree line of the thick jungle and off the edge, forming a waterfall which flowed over and plummeted into the pitch black of whatever was below. For a moment, the man stopped mid-step, which dug his bare heel into the dirt underfoot, and he glanced around for some. From his perspective, he was at the edge of the accessible land, and the massive forepaws of the reptilian beast must have caused the man to believe that it would fare better than he on the extreme cliffside. The saurian god ruled this jungle, and no matter where he went, it would follow. Finally, as the thing broke the tree line with hundreds of accompanied snapping branches, the man all at once seemed to decide on the best possibility for his survival. Better to die in the fall with a small chance for survival than to stand and fight the colossal predator which would have been certain death. With a running start, the man rushed towards the falling waters, leapt madly from the safety of the earth, and plunged wildly into the unknown, in which he was swallowed by water and darkness. The massive lizard clawed at the ground and roared like a scolded child whose toy had been taken away, before finally whirling about and disappearing into the luminescent jungle foliage. Hours passed until the man reappeared on an unlit shore, having disappeared from the knowledge of almost all. Unknown to him, he had been nearly consumed by a hideous gelatinous thing in those cold and watery depths until its attention was drawn by larger prey and it released him from its slithery, pale appendages. Longer still was it that the man, now washed clean of the soot and blood which his journey had stained him with, awoke exhausted and broken upon that cold shore. As he did so, the flowers of the deep began to bloom as if in response to his consciousness. As they did so, the spiny flora began to shine with a brilliant shade of violet which the man had never seen and which clearly had an effect upon him. Despite what seemed like a few broken ribs, his one broken arm, and his injured leg, which made him hobble as he walked, the man rose, grasping what he could for balance, and began walking through the field of glowing purple flowers which rose to his waist. His eyes dilated, his breaths grew deep, and the man walked on aimlessly through the hidden beauty of this otherwise terrible underworld. Here and there, throughout the field of strangely illuminated vegetation, large stalagmite spikes sprung up, rising to a height 2 to 3 times that of a man, and at the base nearly as wide. Although the flowers seemed to have cast a cloud upon his mind with a jolt of pure revulsion, the man stood for a moment, quivering in abject horror. It was my appendages which he saw at first sight. Although he had not seen the scaly and claw-like hands which extended from each one of my arenaeid limbs, the movement of the greater bulk of my arms and body had aroused the man's heightened senses. Many men have come across my path in this self-same way, as I love the cat and mouse play before enjoying the final feasting, perfumed and surrounded by the flowers of Ilkthari. I watched those dropped into the underworld from the outset, clinging to the slick walls of the caverns, as the entire experience, their pain, their despair, and their fear creates the sweetest of aromas, like an intoxicating incense, creeping through the dark and watching as they try and mostly fail to survive throughout the underworld's perils is to me what humans enjoy when taking in a play with actors masked and adorned in brightly tinseled attire. When most men survive as long as this one has, their overwrought minds usually cause them to fling themselves at me in furious death throes. Perhaps their primitive minds simply think that they can actually slay a being as such as I. Possibly rather than that, there is something bred deep within man that needs to try and exterminate things with a general appearance like myself, as like when men, going down to the smallest of children, squash a bug beneath a club or foot. Perhaps the culmination of events simply breaks their minds, and seeing my hideous visage, to what degree they can behold it, makes them react on their most basic of instincts, and to slay or flee is an immediate response. Of all the men that have been dropped down into the pit, this man was the only one, the smartest one, who fled. It was, of course, to no avail, but the scent of fear and exhaustion spurred me on in a ravenous anticipation. First, I devoured his hands and feet, clotting the wounds with my saliva so as to keep the man alive for as long as possible and savor the deliciousness of the event, as I know it will be some time before I next feed. Once his mode of flight was gone, I took my time with his arms and legs. Unfortunately, the man did not remain conscious during this part of the feeding, however.
For one brief moment, he awakened before the end. He woke rather suddenly, as though due to some horrid nightmare, only to find that his real situation was far worse. As he did so, I caught his eyes with my own and stared deeply, almost comfortingly, into those glassy, bloodshot orbs. There was a moment that it seemed like he thought I would let him live. But just as I could see the emotion written upon his face, I pulled his still beating heart from his chest and held it before his face, beginning to nibble upon it as a child eats a bit of candy, while he watched on until he gave up the ghost. All was over for the young man, but my feast was still before me. I relished every morsel.